This is the Sustainable IT Insights channel with David Daoud, hosted on the Bright Talk Network. As a principal analyst at the advisory firm Compliance Standards LLC and host of the Trending Paths podcast, David brings you this new episode exploring the challenges of managing sustainable IT practices. Thank you for tuning in to this latest episode.
Well, hello, and thanks for being here. I'm Paul Desmond, Content Strategist with CIO Marketing Services, and I'm glad you could join us for this webinar focused on security risks inherent in the IT asset disposition process, or ITAD. Well, every company and every vertical has to deal with the process of removing IT assets at some point. Typically, lots of attention is paid to doing so in an environmentally sound manner, which of course is a good idea. But the idea of ensuring security in the process probably doesn't get as much attention. That is, at least until we hear about some company that suffers a major breach because of that inattention. And we'll hear about one such company in a few minutes. Well, today we've got a pair of experts on hand to educate us on some of the security issues to consider in the ITAD process, and you're going to meet them in just a few seconds. Before we jump in, I want to remind you there's lots of resources and assets available about today's topic in the resources section of your player. So be sure to check those out and download freely. I also want to thank our sponsors, Compliance Standards and Sage Sustainable Electronics, for making today's event possible. Well, let's meet our speakers. First up, we've got David Daoud, who's been researching issues around hardware disposition for more than 20 years. He currently serves as principal analyst with Compliance Standards, an advisory and research firm specializing in IT management and IT product lifecycle services. David previously spent more than 13 years at IDC, where he spearheaded the creation of IDC's GRADE certification. And GRADE stands for Green, Recycling, and Asset Disposal for the Enterprise. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Also on hand is Bob Houghton, who brings more than 30 years of experience to ITAD, to his position as co-founder and CEO of Sage Sustainable Electronics. There, he has defined best practices for the industry in security, asset management, and responsible recycling. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, before I dive into the first question, I want to kind of set the table here for a few events that have been going on that sort of lead to a steady influx of IT assets that need to be removed. First up, we've got Windows 10 support, which ends late next year. So there's lots of movement already to Windows 11, and that typically means a new PC. Likewise, there's a big push going on for AI PCs. IDC predicts AI PCs are going to account for nearly 60% of all PCs shipped by the end of 2027, and that movement is already well underway. All the machines that were installed at the beginning of the COVID era, many of them in workers' homes, are coming due for a refresh. We've also got the usual assortment of networking equipment, servers, and various data center equipment that's likewise being replaced at a pretty rapid clip, especially as the cloud movement continues apace. So all of that brings us to the question of how to safely retire all this old equipment. So my first question, I'm going to direct this to you, David, is when an enterprise hires, say, company X to take away its old IT equipment, isn't there an expectation that this company X will do that responsibly and handle it all securely, or at least that any fallout is on them if they don't do that? What do you think, David?
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. So the company that's hiring an ITAD service provider generally, obviously, would expect that that contractor would take on the responsibility for securing retired data-bearing assets. That's normal. After all, as you know, the ITAD vendor, assuming they are a certified vendor, should have the prerequisite skills and the resources to perform very important tasks, such as proper data wiping and other related tasks. By the way, that includes having the proper software and the licenses for that software to perform data erasure. But certainly there are many problems in the current environment, starting with the fact that a lot of the things can go wrong when even before an ITAD vendor is involved. That is, the moment a company disconnects a device from its network, that device is obviously prone to a series of missteps and physical handling issues that could obviously result in the wrong outcome. Well, if that is the case, then the company clearly failed to respond to at least two areas of the law that courts would absolutely highlight. Well, the first case is the fact that the company's ITAD practice is not part of a required comprehensive enterprise risk assessment. That's a big problem. In this case, prosecutors and plaintiffs will demonstrate that the company neglected to conduct a broad and detailed risk assessment. Now, many companies that spend millions of dollars, perhaps even billions of dollars on hardening their cybersecurity posture are often and sometimes completely unaware that there is a real opportunity for data losses on the back end, which is, in this case, the IT asset disposition phase. Now, related to this is what the law calls neglecting to control security threats and absence of mitigation procedures. Likewise, court would definitely look at why and how anyone may have had unauthorized access to, let's say, a disk drive, for example, by questioning the company's measures to safeguard data-bearing devices like using encryption technology. So as you can see, the moment a device is unplugged, a problem can happen. But when the devices are taken over by an ITAD vendor, there is this old saying that says trust but verify. The company has to have a series of policies in place that define the relationship between it and its partner in a way that satisfied its own compliance requirements. And a final thought on this, regardless of its contract a company has with an ITAD vendor, courts will not accept any argument made about transferring responsibility to the ITAD vendor. A company is fully responsible for the data it owns, for the data it holds, and its loss would inevitably spell legal trouble regardless. Now, the company could file a separate suit against its ITAD vendor over breach of contract, if any, but the responsibility is still going to remain with it during the course of the case.
Okay, so lots can go wrong. Bob, what kinds of things have you seen go wrong, or what's your take on this whole issue?
Speaking as a service provider that provides ITAD services, we depend on two major points of collaboration that can be points of failure with our customers. One is policy. It's extremely important that security policies be well defined so that everyone in the customer's organization are aligned behind that policy. And the other is practice. The ITAD vendor can't be exclusively responsible for ensuring the security of these retired devices. In fact, if you look at all of the breaches resulting around the ITAD process, most of them are failures of asset management on the part of the client that occur in the client's facility, where an unlocked storeroom allows access to people that simply take stuff, or assets are simply misplaced and lost. So failures of policy and failures of practice are the first point in putting together a secure ITAD program and ultimately ensuring that the refresh process is fully secure at the end of life.
Okay. My next question gets to the legal issues or regulations that come into play here. David, I think you touched on this, but could you go into that a little more and to some of the legal issues around maintaining security in the ITAD process?
Yes, certainly, Paul. So there are a number of them for sure. The first thing to know when it comes to regulation is that regulations do not generally mandate what to do in terms of mitigating the risk. What the regulations mandate is that what you should not be doing, and it would define some of the outcomes to avoid. The second thing to know specific to regulations is that there are common concerns or common denominators, if you will, among all the data security laws affecting ITAD. And by the way, the same applies to cybersecurity, for example. Now, whether it's HIPAA laws, whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley, whatever regulation out there, the same concepts tend to repeat from law to law, which is essentially do no harm. Now, broadly speaking, there are concerns over so risk management on the one hand, and the device security management on the other hand. Those are two different things. Well, in the first case, that is in the risk management side, the laws want you to have a corporate risk assessment that obviously should include ITAD. In relation to that, the courts would want you to have clear risk mitigation procedures where all aspects of your ITAD program must be subject to a mitigation process that would contain the risks that you face along the entire ITAD operation, from such things as on-site data destruction, data wiping, logistics and transportation, to asset tracking, inventory management, all the way to vendor certifications and audits. Well, staying on the risk management side, the courts would also look at how you structured your relationships with the ITAD vendor. It will look at how adherent to the law your contract with that vendor are. For the courts, one of the main concerns is that an ITAD contract should enhance the data security aspects of your project, and clearly failure to do so, the courts would side against the company. The final aspect on the data, on the risk management category, is the requirement to issue what they call timely breach notifications. In many cases, companies take a long time to notify the authorities and those affected, of course. And obviously, this exposes the company in a dangerous way to more litigation. So that's on the management side. On the device side, courts would have issues with device accessibility, and by extension, it would want to know what kind of on-device security procedures were put in place, such as encryption, for example. So all of these areas are very important for companies to very much pay attention to them, and showcase that they are serious about their compliance with requirements and the laws in general.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Bob, as an ITAD provider, what's your take on this, between the legal issues and regulations and also the risks that people need to protect against?
Well, it's a very common contract provision that the ITAD provider indemnify its customers against the costs of a data breach. So financially speaking, there is that indemnification. Consequently, ITAD providers take extreme care when performing security services for customers. Indemnification, of course, is dependent on the financial wherewithal of the ITAD provider and its insurance, and it can't undo brand damage. It can't undo reputational damage with employees and the other kinds of damage that accrue from a data breach. But financially speaking, indemnification is common in the contract.
And how, as a client, how do I ensure that the ITAD provider has, as you said, the resources to back up that indemnification?
Well, I think that's part of the due diligence process that has to be performed when an ITAD RFP is being put out to the marketplace by a large enterprise. Financial wherewithal is, it demands financial statements be offered. There should be evidence of the insurance policies in place. The average cost of a data breach can exceed $7 or $8 million, and so, in some cases, substantially more than that. So, it takes a very robust cybersecurity insurance policy for an ITAD provider to be able to cover those kinds of indemnifications. And, one of the things that is most surprising to me, and I think it may be an effect from the pandemic, is that large customers, when they're contracting at least with Sage, in the old days would send audit teams into our facilities to verify that we're operationally capable in the terms that we're promising, security services to the customer. They go and they look at it physically. That almost never occurs now in recent experience. And I think that's a gap because everybody looks great on their own website. Everybody can hire good writers to respond to RFPs. Ultimately, it takes operational rigor and governance and a lot of experience to do this reliably for customers.
Yeah, it puts me in mind of the Morgan Stanley case where, I guess you would say they didn't do all that due diligence. Do you want to tell us a little about that?
Well, the Morgan Stanley case, from the perspective of the ITAD provider, is a failure of policy. And what ended up happening is that an unqualified service provider was contracted by, a responsible party at Morgan Stanley and didn't properly sanitize hardware. And a breach resulted that has cost Morgan Stanley more than $160 million at this point, and still counting in fines and costs. And it really boiled down to a manager who determined that they might do better for their company by cutting corners and saving a few $100,000 on service fees. And, in this case got caught by an incompetent service provider and lack of their due diligence has cost them more than $160 million.
So, that clearly is a failure in the whole risk-reward equation. David, you mentioned some of the risks here. How should company address all these risks? I know the both of you have collaborated on a white paper that outlines these steps in some detail, but I wonder if you could just give us some highlights of some of the most important steps you see to mitigate risks.
Yeah, just to echo what Bob said, really what's revealing about the Morgan Stanley case, Paul, is that a mid-level employee decided that saving the company $100,000 was a priority for them. Look, this is a more widespread phenomenon than most people are aware. Senior executives in companies have been very vocal about being serious about data security and the environment and ESG, etc. But that's not always reflected throughout the rest of the organization, and particularly for mid-level employees, it's often about showing good faith and entrepreneurial spirits, and it's quite often about money. And that could be a problem when you have end of life being a very critical link in the IT asset management world with data security issues, with environmental issues. So we are definitely seeing a shift towards companies' willingness to invest in proper disposal practices. It's better in some vertical sectors than others, vertical sectors that are very sensitive to laws and regulations, but there is still a very, very large proportion of U.S. organizations that have for example, no budgeting policy on ITAD. So when it's time to retire aging assets, managers that are in charge of that program don't really know where the money is coming from. And so quite often they lean on an ITAD vendor who favors sort of revenue sharing models only. Revenue sharing model is a good thing, but in this case, it's only about revenue sharing model, and many tend to neglect to perform proper due diligence and look at other scenarios of how to recycle and retire those devices. There are many ways for recycling those devices. Recycling may not be the right term, but there's cascading into the organization. There is a reselling to the secondary market that is getting involved in the charity space, etc. So that is probably one of the first places that senior executives in charge of IT asset management and IT in general, and others as well, folks that are in procurement, folks that are in finance, etc. This is the first area that they must assess how to create a reasonable budget to protect the company. As Bob stated earlier, and the Morgan Stanley case confirmed to us, having an ITAD vendor, even with all the certifications and the references, a company is not shielded against the law. It is important that the ITAD vendor has their own insurance, indemnifications, etc. But that's not what the courts concluded in the Morgan Stanley case specifically. It's now, as Bob mentioned earlier, on track to paying $160 million in fine and counting. And there is, of course, a reputational risk that could take a big hit, and we know that. So in selecting an ITAD vendor, a procurement officer has to be careful in identifying the weaknesses of that potential vendor. For example, a small ITAD vendor, and there are many small ones, there are dozens of small ones, may not have the scale and the financial muscle to be your partner. On the other hand, we know some large vendors that are, I would call them conglomerates, if you will, and own an ITAD division. That ITAD unit is generally minuscule compared to their core businesses. Hence, you must probe their seriousness in terms of how sustainable their ITAD business is in the long term. That is why transparency from an ITAD vendor is very, very important, and where a combination of due diligence, a solid contract, and of course, some intuition for sure could help reduce the risk of picking up the wrong partner out there.
I would add to what David's saying and point out that there's a kind of catch-22 in the procurement process in many large enterprises, and that is simply that ITAD is unique in procurement terms because there's a cost for services that typically is charged as fees. And then in many cases, probably virtually all cases, a portion of the material that's being recovered by the ITAD service provider is being remarketed, and the proceeds of that sale then are shared back with the customer. The catch is that if you depend on remarketing proceeds as an ITAD vendor to make up for low service fees, then if the customer sends you relatively low value stuff, the remarketing proceeds won't cover the cost of performing the service, and a provider can be tempted to cut corners. So I think the best practice is for the procurement person, whoever is running an ITAD RFP, to ignore their instinct to go with the very lowest price offered and look at the overall value. My advice is always make sure that the service pricing is sufficient to cover robust service provisions around at least data security, so that there's no temptation on the vendor's part to cut corners and expose the customer to risk.
That makes sense. But Bob, are there other processes companies should put in place, to make sure they've got all these bases covered, they're vetting the vendor properly and taking care of their equipment properly before the ITAD process begins?
Well, I think that the one thing that may be counterintuitive to many organizations looking at an ITAD program is that in security terms, the security of the program depends on the asset management prowess of the company. So it's really an inventory management challenge that creates the security if the challenge is met. So speaking as a service provider, Sage qualifies customers that we're interested in working with and that we must be successful with, of course. We look for, number one, do they have an ITAD budget, or are they counting on resale proceeds to make their budget work? Because that's a red flag. But the other is, are they relatively mature in asset management? If they're already managing their technology inventory well, and there are many that do, then that's a good sign that the customer can do their part in security, and that facilitates the service provider being successful to deliver security. The process that most people think about when they think about an ITAD performing data security services, the drive wiping that we do using the software that David mentioned earlier. That is, once we have possession of the assets, really foolproof. And it's not the point of failure that usually creates a data breach. Usually it's mishandled inventory, lost items, stolen items, and in some cases, misdirected items, an item that perhaps is scheduled for redeployment back into the enterprise and therefore has not been sanitized, is sold rather than redeployed, and the service provider doesn't catch that. So inventory management and controlling inventory at a serialized level, and then integrating that with the ITAD's processes is the sort of executional silver bullet that you need, in addition to having a budget that's capable of paying for services regardless of the value of the material being dispositioned.
David, what's your take on this, the whole budgeting piece of this, and what sort of advice do you give to clients on how they should properly budget for ITAD?
Well, so clearly, Paul, there is no doubt that the oversight over ITAD in the enterprise has to be elevated to higher ranks in the company and across various stakeholders. Not just IT departments, but it has to involve obviously procurement. It has to involve folks in cybersecurity, because cybersecurity tend to be much more active in terms of understanding risks and doing proper risk assessment. So ITAD could be part and parcel of this. Certainly we have to broaden the understanding of ITAD beyond these groups to folks that are in the compliance world, in the legal world. And clearly, top management has to be aware of the importance of ITAD to give it the proper attention and proper resources. There's the need for ensuring that assessments, that rules and mitigation policies exist, and that budget are properly allocated. So when you look at that, and when you look at what the reality is all about today, you would see a huge disconnect. For example, in the case of Morgan Stanley, just to repeat that one, we know that Morgan Stanley spends probably $7 to $8 billion a year in ensuring that it has the best technology. So a lot of resources, a lot of attention, a lot of thinking have been put there in terms of buying new equipment, managing that system, whether it's data centers, software and technology and platforms and PCs and devices. When you get to the end of it, there's a tiny little thing called IT asset disposition that is poorly understood, and yet that is the function that carries some of the biggest risks. I mean, where else in the entire life of a system or in an entire IT asset management discipline would you find environmental risk than in the IT asset disposition? That's where things can happen. And the same thing applies, on the data security front for sure. So I think, expanding the thinking process about ITAD from the way it's being managed today. And today, in our calculations, 70 to 75% of U.S. companies are the IT department is responsible for ITAD. And so we're talking about typically an IT professional who is in charge of a function that is about the environment, data security, financial issues, logistical issues, a number of things that are not necessarily the purview of an IT professional or an IT manager. And so really bringing ITAD to a variety of key stakeholders, understanding the consequences of not doing the right things, to me, that's probably a good start. And in that discussion among these various stakeholders is understanding the budgeting aspect of it. Because at the end of the day, it has to be budgeted. It is not a costly initiative. it's not a big problem. They should be able to, incorporate common sense budgeting practices to ensure that data is safe, but to also ensure that their environmental footprint is reduced at a time where everybody's talking about ESG, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the ideal customer approach to managing the policy creation and the governance of an ITAD program, to be specific about the stakeholders that David was mentioning, it needs to certainly include IT. It needs to include a stakeholder from asset management, which sometimes is inside IT, sometimes not. There's always a procurement role that needs to be included. Security has to be included. Environmental, finance should be included, because even though the expense is relatively small, there needs to be governance around that finance function. And then for some customers, philanthropy is included as a stakeholder, because these assets that are being retired, at least the endpoint devices, can be refurbished and donated to benefit the digital equity initiatives that an enterprise may have at a board level or at a senior executive level. So those 6 or 7 stakeholders should be engaged in choosing a vendor, forming the policies, and then the periodic checkpoints of governing the vendor relationship to ensure that ITAD is being handled in a robust and compliant manner.
So I have one other question that kind of riffs off something you both mentioned, with the whole idea of sustainability. And it seems when it comes to ITAD lately, the emphasis has certainly been on sustainability and responsibly recycling or disposing of IT assets, which of course is a valid concern. But I wonder if you think that's come at the expense of a concern over security, or if the two intersect somehow. Bob, you want to start us off on
that? I think that security is the necessary predicate to sustainability, because sustainability is an issue that can be leveraged very substantially by the amount of repurposing that occurs in the inventory of dispositioned assets. So to be a little bit more specific, if you look at the overall lifetime environmental impact of an electronic device, up to 80% of its lifetime impact occurs during manufacture. So it follows then that by extending the life as much as possible, either inside the enterprise by lengthening life cycles, or by repurposing a device after the enterprise is through with it for another user, extending those life cycles is an extremely effective way of stretching the sustainability or minimizing the environmental impact of manufacture. And in fact, if you compare reuse, where you're refurbishing a device for a second user, versus recycling, where the device is broken down to recover commodity materials that can be used in another manufacturing process, reuse produces 20 times the amount of environmental benefit or more than recycling does. So even though recycling is, it has a green reputation, reuse is many orders of magnitude more green. And in fact, in order to repurpose devices, security policies will absolutely require that they be fully sanitized, and that can be procedurally guaranteed, so that second user is not inheriting confidential information or personally identifiable information from the original owner.
Yeah, I agree with Bob. I think that if a company is very serious about its ESG pronouncements and ESG goals, anything short of reusing a retired device into a secondary market of sort, whether it's charitable the charity world, NGOs, reselling it in the secondary market, anything else than that, let's say the recycling part of it, which is sort of destroying the system and turning it into commodities, is absolutely irresponsible in terms of where a company stands today in terms of its ESG pronouncement. It's fair to say that every US company has a goal to reduce its environmental footprint, carbon emissions, and a number of decisions they've made in terms of how to reduce their environmental footprint. If you can't achieve any of this if you don't handle the data security aspect of it, you do not want anything that is part of your data storage to move out into a secondary market with the data still there in the device. So absolutely, the data security aspect is critical in ensuring that you are compliant with your own ESG procurement or ESG rules. That you are compliant with your own ESG rules, and that's absolutely the first step, and that is necessary. So, paying attention to that is highly critical. Who is in charge of this? Obviously, selecting the right ITAD vendor, but also ensuring that you have the right staff and the right budget to do so.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but we have just a couple minutes left for some closing thoughts. Any message you want to leave folks with? Bob, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think that the key points are, policy, establishing a budget, focusing on good asset management rigor to control the inventory, and then the final thought is maybe a practical matter. Some security professionals may be tempted by this discussion to say, well, okay, with this much risk and potential liability, we're just going to destroy everything, or at least destroy the data bearing elements of the devices, which is costly in financial terms, it's costly in environmental terms, and it actually leaves a gap, because physical destruction is essentially an analog process. The process that the ITAD performs to sanitize devices using software produce a digital record of the successful sanitization of the device. So in essence, it produces what we call tongue-in-cheek the alibi papers that a customer needs to prove that a given device and a given hard drive installed in that device was successfully sanitized. So physical destruction, in my opinion, is not as secure as digital destruction, and those records are the real deliverable value that an ITAD can provide the enterprise customer, that becomes the proof that they need to demonstrate to a court or to their customers or their employees that they've done the appropriate due diligence and received the service delivery that proves that security was achieved.
Interesting tip. Thank you. David, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, so Paul, I think my closing thought would be really addressing an issue that we really haven't raised, which in my opinion is very, very important. So as we look into the trends that are expected to shape the next generation of PCs and generally data-bearing devices, we should expect the issue of data security to be even potentially more pronounced, potentially more severe in the years to come, if not tackled head-on with common sense management policies and security protocol. And that's certainly going to be the case on the end of life of the device in the ITAD space. So number one of the first implications of the advances taking place in artificial intelligence is the explosive need for more storage to accommodate a massive injection of data. As you know, AI is speeding up the introduction of what's called neural processing units, or NPUs, specialized hardware accelerators for AI and machine learning tasks, which will certainly lead to more demand for larger storage capacities in PCs and other devices. This trend will mean that what used to be processed on the cloud and in data center could now be processed on the device itself. And that is the idea here, is to reduce sort of the dependency on the cloud. This evolution will, without any doubt, expand the amount of data stored not only in the data center, but also, and more importantly, in the client device itself. This is a problem that cybersecurity experts will have to deal with, but also those in charge of ITAD in the enterprise. Second point is AI technology is also expected to keep track of all user activity through what's called archiving, thereby, again, increasing the amount of data that will be stored within the device, what will be certainly high-capacity SSDs or hard drives. With AI, models need to be continuously learning and refined for the purpose of more accuracy. Storing historical data locally for retaining or updating AI models will absolutely lead to a greater need for larger storage system in PC. So what are the implications? Well, there are at least two implications, and probably more, but the two ones that come to mind immediately specific to ITAD is companies must incorporate a much more comprehensive data security policies that effectively would secure high-capacity data-bearing devices during their terminal phases going forward in the next 3, 4, 5 years to come. And secondly, and that's sort of the final thought, really, companies must be able to vet their ITAD vendors on that vendor's ability to process and secure AI-related technology. So I think, so this is, the conclusion is sort of more of the forward-looking situation. And that forward-looking situation means that we're going to have a lot more data to deal with, and therefore we have to have rules and partners that are able to cope with that trend. And I think we've provided to listeners some pointers on how to get there for sure.
Yeah, although you're right, we didn't talk about that whole storage issue. That sounds like a good teaser for another webinar, perhaps, but we'll see. Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. We've covered a lot of ground here. I've been chatting with our panelists, David Daoud of Compliance Standards and Bob Houghton of Sage Sustainable Electronics. I want to thank you both for taking the time to share your expertise. I think this has been a really valuable discussion. Thanks also to Compliance Standards and Sage for sponsoring today's session. And finally, thanks to you for your time and attention today. One more reminder, there's lots of information and assets about this topic in the resources section of your player, so be sure to check that out and download lots of valuable resources. For Compliance Standards, Sage Sustainable Electronics, and CIO Marketing Services, I'm Paul Desmond. Thanks for tuning in.
You just listened to an episode of the Sustainable IT Insights channel. Please subscribe to this channel. More information can be obtained here and on our podcast website at trendingpaths.com. Until our next talk, thank you and goodbye.